So I actually think like it's both, right? Like paying attention to what's driving this, like first and foremost, there's a consumer, like user, people side of this, but there's also there's commercial interest at play too in making sure data is protected, or at least you know where it's going, because that's, a value to you as a first party.
Hi everyone, it's Wednesday, June 30th. Thanks for listening to the Behind the Numbers ad platform, an eMarketer podcast made possible by VTEX. I'm your host, Principal Analyst Nicole Perrin, and this is my platform to talk about advertising with some of the smartest and most interesting people I know. And joining me to do that today is Alex Cohn, Vice President, Privacy and Data Protection at IAB Tech Lab. Hi, Alex. How's it going?
Hey, Nicole. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. We're going to be talking about a couple different things, including some recent announcements from Apple's Worldwide Developer Conference. And I think we're also probably going to mention a recent update from Google.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, yeah. No, super psyched to have you on. And let's introduce you a little bit to our listeners. We've been doing this little mini segment at the top to set up the episode a little bit. I'm going to ask you first about IAB Tech Lab. Usually I ask what kinds of companies are your clients and what's the main problem you're trying to help them solve. So I guess in this case, I'll ask instead, what kind of companies are your constituents and what are you helping them with?
Yeah, that's a good reframing of your typical question. Tech Lab works with a range of different participants sort of in the digital marketing space. So our constituents are everyone from digital content producers, aka publishers, to the various ad technology in between that kind of makes the ecosystem run, and then agencies. And even recently, we've been starting to get some brands interested in our tech standards work. So those are the constituents, and what are we helping them with? We, as a technical standards org for the digital advertising ecosystem, we're trying to basically create ways to give this ecosystem opportunities to interoperate at sort of like core levels so that, different products and, different sort of constituents don't have to worry about kind of one-off ways to integrate with one another. So, at the end of the day, we help sort of our ecosystem interoperate in a way that allows them to focus on things that actually differentiate them.
Yeah, that's obviously really, really important. And now let's talk a little bit about you.
Sure.
So before the show, I shared with you our estimates of average daily media consumption among U.S. adults, and we like to pick on people a little bit and have them admit something unusual about themselves. So tell us where you're a little bit of an outlier because you consume either more or less than the daily average amount of media.
So I scanned the thing that you sent me, and I looked alphabetically for this, and then I didn't see it. So then I actually looked at the whole thing and couldn't find it. The answer is books, physical pieces of
dead tree books.
I spend an inordinate amount of my morning, usually starting around 5:30 a.m. until about.
Ooh, I love another early morning person.
Until about 8:30, usually reading. So
that's my ideal lifestyle. I'm a big reader also. I do have an e-reader, but I have a really strong preference for physical books. I really find I retain a lot better if I read a physical book. I don't know if you have that experience.
I don't feel like I retain anything in any form, but I enjoy it.
You like it. You love the
user experience. The user experience is optimal.
Yeah, totally agree. Devote a large chunk of this apartment to physical books. There's some behind me, but there's more elsewhere. So I love that. Love that. We're going to talk probably for all of the rest of this conversation about digital media.
Sure.
I'm sure you don't know anything about consuming digital media. You're spending all your time with books instead. Yeah. But let's start talking about some of the stuff that went down at Apple's Worldwide Developer Conference, or WWDC, earlier this month.
Mm-hmm.
A few big announcements around privacy that took the attention of the digital marketing and media world. So let's talk about Hide My Email. Can you explain what it is that Apple has announced about this Hide My Email function and what it's going to affect as far as marketers?
Sure. So Hide My Email at its core has what it does in the name, in the sense that it's functionality that works on Apple devices and apps. So, if you're on Safari, for example, and you go to a form that is, you're signing up for something and using your email, it's going to give you a prompt. It's going to recognize that you're entering an email, and it's going to give you a prompt to choose whether you want to, what I call it is like scoping your email to just that site or app, because it's not just Safari. So
that's really a technical standards person term for what's going on here.
But what I mean is like an email specifically tailored for, CNN.
Yep.
So I actually equate it to something that, a lot of people I think are familiar with. When you sell something on Craigslist creates sort of a dummy email for you.
Yes.
For that item.
Yes.
So that if it's a crazy person on the other end, they don't have your email. And this is somewhat equivalent, except instead of it being per item, it's per like site you visit or app you visit. And it's giving you this option to say, hey, I don't want to share my actual email with this site or app. I want you, Apple operating system, to create an email that you send to that, publisher or brand or whoever it is.
So basically, to the extent that marketers and other entities are relying on email as the identifier that exists across channels, it potentially is no longer going to be uniform across channels.
Yeah. So it is good to compartmentalize, and you're spot on. If someone collecting email still wants to send email marketing, they can still send you an email. It's going to get redirected through an Apple server where they've created this dummy email and eventually get to you, right? In the same way that the Craigslist email gets to you, or I think eBay does the same thing. So that's not entirely affected, although Apple did announce something on the tracking side of just sending email. But yes, exactly. So, as Apple and Google have been, cracking down on what they've really focused on, which is cross-site and cross-app tracking, and cookies and device identifiers are the way that that's been done at scale today. A lot of the industry has said, okay, well, one common thing that we could connect on is email. And if, again, in my example, CNN has my email and Nike has my email, it's the same email. Like, they could use that as sort of a connection point, either in real time sort of bidded stuff or after the fact in analytics. And that obviously is coming sort of, I guess, threat's probably the wrong word. It's in target for what the platforms are trying to stop. It's interesting, and then I'll stop and we can move on to another question. But it's not just Apple who is focused on this sort of what I would call like surface area for cross-site and cross-app tracking. Google Chrome actually has a proposal in this W3C process called WebID, which does effectively the same thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's like a known thing in the browser and operating system community that the advertising community is thinking about using email as a connection point. So the platforms are taking aim at that.
Yeah. And I also just kind of want to point out, in case it's not clear, especially for listeners who might not kind of specialize in this, obviously consumers have long, some consumers have long used like a burner email address or an email address that they use specifically for signing up to stuff because they don't want to be spammed with a ton of promotional emails and stuff. But if you're using a burner email, like all of the guys doing identity resolution based on email are likely able to connect that burner email with the rest of your online persona. So this is different and a bigger deal than just like a traditional user operated secondary email address.
That's a really good point. And I hadn't actually myself considered that. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit, you wrote a blog post 2 weeks ago about some of the effects of these Apple announcements. And you wrote in that post that privacy, data protection, and accountability are increasingly important to business growth, not just compliance. And if your post third-party cookie strategies don't take this truth into account, you're going to miss the boat. So can you unpack that a little bit for listeners?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think unless you're living on an island with no news, which more power to you.
Seriously.
And enjoy listening to the eMarketer podcast. That people and governments and platforms are all sort of swirling around this issue of data control, right? So like, as it relates to advertising, as it relates to other things, right? Just like literally there's stories almost daily, I think, at this point in the news about some sort of data concern. So the status quo of digital advertising has been, and its growth has been predicated somewhat on data and identity, at its most fundamental core, right? Like efficiency and effectiveness for advertisers in digital ecosystems means like being able to frequency cap, meaning I know that Alex is the same user across sites and apps, being able to attribute spend. I know that when I serve Alex an ad on New York Times and he lands back on Samsung or whatever, like that's, I can attribute that. Such fundamental concepts, right? Being questioned because of, hey, the way to achieve that is in most users' sort of parlance is like, I'm being tracked. So the reason I wrote what I wrote is that while I think Apple's commercial step, this was in the headline, that they're like vying for primacy with an M, not privacy with a V, primacy among first parties, meaning like, hey, we're going to decide for you that all of these other first parties shouldn't be able to do this. Like, I think that is an overstep, but I don't think it's an overstep to say, hey, we need to do better on privacy. So, and doing better isn't about meeting just exactly the letter of the law. It's like trying to skate to where the puck is. So what I'm saying is like, when I say it's a growth strategy, I mean like strategically, if you don't have an answer for why what you're doing is defensible, like as a first party that's employing a bunch of like tech vendors, it's less about compliance at that point. It's more about like, how am I going to grow? If you're an advertiser and trying to grow customers, like grow my business and grow lifetime value of a user. If you're a publisher, how am I going to entice advertisers to my site or app? And if your answer to those doesn't have like solid defensible answers for privacy and like how you're held accountable to those like privacy promises, I think it's, you should really rethink that or start thinking about it.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, and I think, probably part of what you're saying is also about the fact that this isn't just laws coming out of nowhere and platform changes coming out of nowhere. It is driven by consumer concerns. So it's not just something that advertisers or other entities should be trying to just like route around. And, as we've often heard in this industry, just find a quote unquote cookie replacement so they can just kind of plug something else in and keep doing everything else the way that they've been doing, right?
Right. User, like people concerns and even commercial concerns. Like, because you think about advertisers have contracts with their agencies that say, this is my data. Publishers have contracts with their ad server and SSP saying you cannot like, so I actually think like it's both, right? Like paying attention to what's driving this, like first and foremost, there's a consumer, like user people side of this, but there's also like, there's commercial interest at play too in making sure data is protected, or at least where it's going, because that's, a value to you as a first party. So like all of these things are kind of swirling right now. And I think hard for most people to pin down exactly like what's going on. But the answer is there's a lot of like sort of factors at play here. It's not just one thing.
Yeah, for sure. And, another one of my analyst colleagues here at Insider Intelligence, Sarah M. Watson, had a recent report published on privacy as a competitive advantage.
Mm-hmm.
We definitely see this becoming more important for consumers, and totally agree it'll be important for companies to, continue to grow their market share. I'm going to be back in a minute to talk about more of all of these things swirling around with Alex. But first, just a quick word from our sponsor, VTEX. Retail's next competitive threat may come from a business model or channel that didn't even exist a few months ago. This modern dynamic requires companies to adapt quickly, pivoting business seemingly overnight, something traditional commerce platforms just can't support. There's a new enterprise commerce platform on the rise, one that's fast, flexible, and doesn't require 9 months and $1 million to get up and running. Go to VTEX, VTEX.com/eMarketer to learn more. Awesome. Back with Alex to talk more about Apple and Google and all of the fun privacy news going on these days, which there's a lot of it. So one of the other things that you wrote in your blog post a couple weeks ago is that the latest announcements from Apple aren't a surprise. Now, since you wrote that post, we also had a big announcement from Google. Maybe you think it was a surprise that Google has pushed off its timeline for third-party cookie deprecation by almost 2 years. They say now instead of early 2022, I can't process that it's 2021.
It's COVID. It's COVID's
yes,
fault.
Exactly. So instead of early 2022, they're now saying by the end of 2023, third-party cookies will be totally deprecated in Chrome. They outlined a bunch of the reasons why and a bunch more about the timeline. But I want to talk about this idea of things that are a surprise, whether or not we should have seen them coming, or maybe we did, but then we act like they're a surprise anyway. But these things are roiling the industry. Do you think that people should maybe be a little more circumspect and realistic about some of these developments?
I mean, hindsight is 2020, right? So I think a lot of this stuff is predictable if you have a good framework for thinking about it. And it kind of gets back to what we were talking about before with
exactly.
the underlying zeitgeist here, right? Is people concerned about their data wake and companies concerned about their access to that. So to say I could have predicted that this would happen today, I think, I wouldn't say that. I would say I think it shows some sort of practicalness of the Chrome team at Google who's really been driving this, I think. I don't think it's the ads team. I think it's the Chrome team that's been driving this. I think that they have now been listening to not only the ads industry enough, but also regulators and journalists and other sort of large standards associations and communities and developer communities and all that. And they realize that this is a very complex ecosystem. Well, it's just a complex ecosystem. I was on a thread today with a representative at a very large US-based, or I guess they're a global publisher, and that person said, this was always going to be the case, that this is a really, really hard issue. And this is just really Google or the Chrome team saying okay, it's going to be hard, but we're not stopping. I think that's the key. Is I'm looking at kind of ad tech Twitter, and some people are kind of declaring victory, and I'm I think it's more so that Chrome is being more pragmatic about what's reasonable for shifting how the underpinnings of digital advertising have worked. And I think they're going to take some flack for it from the most zealous sort of privacy community. But I think by and large, most everyone else will breathe a sigh of relief. Whether it was, predictable, I would just say human nature of realizing at some point, we've learned that this is complex and we're going to respond to that fact. That's predictable.
Yes.
2 years extension. I don't think anyone would have predicted that.
Well, that's the piece that surprised me. So I was someone who I would have conversations with people, especially people in ad tech. And I'm sure, there were a lot of them who were like, oh, they're going to delay, for this whole time. Right. And I was really skeptical of that viewpoint until this past April, when there was this sort of delay to the Fledge and Flock Origin trials, and we found out they weren't going to be able to trial Flock in the EU just yet. That's when I said maybe they will kind of have to delay, but I didn't think it would be to the extent that they announced. I do think though, that you're totally right that people should have a framework in place in their own minds and in their own business strategy that kind of assumes that, changes like what Apple announced will happen. I mean, another example that we're not really talking about today has to do with tracking by IP address. Mm-hmm. Apple's taking a big bite out of that. And when I've been talking to people over the past year about, all of these identity changes and what's still available or what's not, IP address comes up a lot. And I never know, because there's a 50-50 chance whether someone's going to say, we know IP is going away someday too, or whether they're going to say, oh, we could do everything by IP because that's still there and that's fine. It's totally 50-50 whether someone's IP is golden or yeah, you can't rely on that.
I relate this not just because you're talking about IP, but I relate this actually to the different channels basically in this space have basically the CTV space has been acting oh, well, privacy is a concern only on web and mobile. And it's no, again, to
how did you know I was talking about CTV people?
Well,
I'm teasing. You knew.
Yeah. So, but the point is not to pick on CTV people, also to pick on podcast people. If you think that people and governments and platforms only care about privacy in the web and mobile, you got another thing coming, because it I'm pretty sure that the average human isn't thinking deeply about their devices' differences.
I mean, we say that all the time, right?
Yeah.
That, it's an omni-channel uniform experience from a customer perspective.
Yeah. So it's a very similar thing. And on the IP thing, I think a lot of people have been, assuming it would stay, because literally an IP is so foundational to how internet web networking works, in terms of how do you know where to respond, how do computers know where to respond to something. So that I think there may have been an assumption from a lot of the community that well, that's untouchable because it's so critical. But I know we're not talking about it right now, but things like Private Relay, which is effectively a VPN, there's still an IP address. It's just the hidden email, it's obfuscated, right? Or
exactly.
It's sort of a dummy.
It's relayed.
It's relayed.
Exactly.
They're really good at naming things at Apple.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about kind of the concept of privacy and what's really at issue here that people and entities care about. Apple's doing this as part of huge marketing efforts that they've been doing around privacy, and just never been a bigger topic in the industry. But what does it mean? It's often not clear what it means, what's important about it, and where maybe some of the issues might be about things like security and control, which was something that you also suggested in your blog post. And you mentioned control as a really important factor earlier in this conversation as well. So what are your thoughts on, if there is more security and control available to players throughout the media and advertising ecosystem, does that change some of what we now call the privacy conversation?
Short answer is yes. More nuanced answer is, I think ultimately people want a default of feeling like they have some sense of being protected, and maybe not even what's going on, but being protected, right? Same thing that you get in your car, you want to know that your tires aren't going to blow up, right? So there's a baseline of it's not a coincidence that my title split has privacy and data protection. I actually, and you look at the GDPR and it's actually about data protection. So it's a baseline for what is a good default for how well different industries can protect data. I think the higher the bar raises on that, the actual necessity to annoy users with privacy prompts changes. And I think that especially appeals to publishers, but also other first parties who don't want to be communicating with the user all the time about like, we're about to track you. So I think a focus on raising that bar is important. And the other reason that I think the focus on raising that bar is important is literally the platforms who are like setting sort of the policy here, which is cross-site and cross-app tracking is bad. They're not saying that tracking on first parties is bad, which is super beneficial to their business models. You know, it's noteworthy, though, that, you know, I say this, I think, in the post, Google, they allow for advertisers to take advertiser data and plug it in through Ads Data Hub, which is their clean room technology, to match audiences of Google's. That is cross context.
Yep.
Period. But what it does have is a bunch of security and data protection. So I think you're spot on that like a big piece of the privacy puzzle is data protection and security. And then I do think controls are important too. So like it may be after all that default baseline, you also still want to say, you know what? I don't want to be in this sort of ecosystem, but there's probably trade-offs to that, right? Because at the end of the day, all this free software is paid for somehow. So it's like, but I think it starts with how do we raise the bar on data protection and security? You're spot on. And then how do we do user transparency and control better? Unfortunately, we're so far behind.
We're really far. Yeah.
Yeah. That I think we have to kind of do them simultaneously. But even Chrome's running into this with Flock, right? Like I think why they didn't release in Europe right off the bat is because they don't have a great answer for e-privacy law in Europe, which is about device access, which Flock is. So there's still going to be some modicum of needing to talk to a user. So I'm not saying that should go away. I'm not saying that at all. It's more just like the conversation that you can have with the user is much less scary if your baseline for data protection and security is much higher.
Yeah. I also feel like, I don't know, I'm frustrated sometimes by the language, by talking so much about privacy and by quote unquote tracking. You know, I'm sure you're aware there's been a ton of talk about how Apple specifically defined tracking to mean cross-site. Mm-hmm. I think a regular person wouldn't necessarily define it that way. They would say like, well, if one entity is following me, recording what I do, that feels like it meets the definition of tracking to a human, right? And yet we have all of this stuff that we talk about privacy when it's like, you're still sharing the information with someone. It's just that they're protecting and controlling it, but that's not like private. If it was private, they wouldn't have it, right?
I mean, yes. I relate this to, are we going to get to the end of this process of recreating advertising outcomes as browser and operating system APIs? And will users feel that anything different?
I mean, no. Why would they? Right?
But that's not to say that we shouldn't try to protect. I'm just saying, like, I think it's a conundrum. And it's probably not, it's probably has to do with why Europe's now talking about, well, should we ban targeting? That's a weird conversation there that's happening, but I get why. Because it's like the outcome that a user feels at the end of the day, especially since what I said before is true, that like advertisers are still going to buy inventory on Google, on YouTube and search and all that via connection. So they're going to feel relevant ads on all the time they spend on Google properties, which is a ton of the time. So I'm not sure, you know, if I think about asking my dad, like, do you still think your phone's listening to you? After we finish all this, I think he'll probably say, yes, I still feel like my phone's listening to me.
Or I still feel like, wow, isn't it weird that I'm getting retargeted for something I like just bought at the grocery store and through, you know, my loyalty card data and all of this, like really like in a lot of cases, long-standing data brokering activities. But I think that a lot of these things have only just been kind of exposed to consumers through digital media, but really the consumers have long been uncomfortable with some of the practices involved here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. It makes me think of the shopping thing. I have an old colleague that went to work at Amazon for their in-store shopping sort of attribution and analytics and all that kind of stuff. Very few people, I think, are talking about the fact that, like, I mean, Ben Thompson and Stratechery is, but like the Amazon has the full search and discovery, shopping cart, checkout, online and increasingly offline that is within their domain.
Yep.
So they're not cross-site tracking.
That's right. Yes, very true. And they have a lot of incredibly commercially valuable data as part of that ecosystem.
I'd say so.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't know, not to show off or anything, but Ben Thompson has referenced some of my research on that topic. So.
Yeah, I mean, I walk my new puppy in the morning and I listen to the daily update. And so, yeah, I'm sure I've actually heard your research referenced. Because I'm a pretty awesome. Religious listener. Anyway,
I'm a religious reader, and I love listening to your puppy back there too.
That's awesome. That's Millie.
Nice to meet her. Okay, well, that's all that we have time for on today's episode of the Behind the Numbers ad platform, an eMarketer podcast made possible by VTEX. Alex, thank you so much for chatting today.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole.
And thanks to everyone for listening. I'll be back in a couple weeks with the next episode of the ad platform. And in the meantime, please continue to let us know what you think at podcasts@emarketer.com. Thanks.